Well, hello there, guys. This is Noob DM Ariel coming back at you on a lovely Saturday afternoon here in Northern California. And it's extremely hot. It's about 102 outside, which is pretty high temperatures for our region. So I'm staying nice and cool in the air condition for the time being. And I thought what I would do today is go over the Dungeon Master's Guide for 4th edition. My last video was on the Renaissance or the resurgence, if you will, of the 4th edition of the game, the much maligned and criticized edition of the game. I will add that, and I have more to say, so I figured we'll stick with 4th edition for right now. And if anybody's watching, I would love to do like a Zoom or an online Roll20 or whatever campaign of 4th edition, or of one that's happening. I'd love to know about it. I personally didn't get into 4th edition until much later. I think about it was out in 2008 or 9ish, and I didn't really play my first 4th edition game until I played on and off, but I didn't really play a steady campaign until about 2014 or 15. By that time, 5th edition had already come out, but it was brand new, so a lot of people still had the 4th edition books and the 4th edition supplements. And even as late as 2019, I briefly played in Ukiah with a bunch of friends, and they were all playing 4th edition. And I said, why haven't you switched over to 5th? And they're like, well, we have all the supplements and we have all the books and we're used to this edition and that's what we like to play. And so we decided to just stick with it because we're not going to reinvest. And that's a typical problem that goes way back when 1st edition switched over to 2nd edition. So I understood that, and I rolled with the punches, and we played 4th edition, and we had fun. Also, a couple of weeks back, I did a blog post on the Dungeon Master's Guide for 3.5 in my gaming blog. And I will put a link of that in the description if you're interested. I thought I had reviewed or talked about or written about the Dungeon Master's Guide for 3rd edition, like the whole thing. But I looked back and it turns out I only did chapter 1. So I had intentions of going through the whole book because I was writing a blog rather than a video like this. It obviously takes longer to jot down your thoughts. And maybe what I'll do is I'll pick up on that after this and do a little bit of both. Do the blog posts with some detail and then just kind of summarize a lot of the ideas from the book, because that was my idea of putting this video series together, comparing all the Dungeon Master guides and see what kind of information DMs, because this is a channel primarily about DMing and playing Dungeons and Dragons, what kind of information, valuable information is found. And I think that because I have all of them except 2nd edition, which I plan to pick up. I never really picked up 2nd edition because I didn't play it, and because I was told that it was very similar to 1st edition, so I was like, there wasn't really a lot of new information. But I do have all the other DM guides that came out since then, at least the core books. I don't have I know 3rd edition had like 2nd and 3rd. I might have 2nd somewhere around. And then 4th edition had a lot more. But the core books I do have from way back, even like some of the basic sets. So I will be comparing and contrasting them because I think that would be interesting to glean what kind of information, what useful information, and maybe at the end rank all of them to see which one is actually at the top. I have a feeling it's going to be 1st edition because that was a very hefty and very good edition of the DM's Guide. It was the OG, but there was a lot of information in that book that players still use, reference even today. Okay, guys, so let's take a look at the Dungeon Master's Guide. Let's see what we have here for 4th edition by Mr. James Wyatt and Andy Collins and Rob Hainsou. So it starts off with chapter 1, how to be a DM, which you find in most of these rule books. and it talks about the dungeon master supplies, basically what you need to play D&D and useful additions. Um, and then it talks about the players. It says everybody plays D&D to have fun, but different people get their enjoyment from different aspects of the game. And then it talks about player motivation. Some people are actors that like to pretend to be characters, and others are more the explorer type, and then others are instigators, which means that they enjoy making things happen. So um, it basically talks about uh, what the players that are going to be in your campaign are like, and how to engage with them, and gives you tips on how to deal with their with their different personalities and what they bring to the table, which is helpful. I don't know if this is unique to fourth edition DM's guide. I'll have to look deeper at the other editions and see if that's a unique um, uh, aspect to this DM's guide for fourth edition. And I should probably preface this by saying that I never picked up the Dungeon Master's Guide for fourth edition until very recently. In fact, I haven't even looked at it in detail very much, even though I owned it for a while. And the reason being is because I was always a player, and I never got a chance to uh, run a game, run a campaign. And so I really didn't have a need for the DM's guide, although I always, in the back of my mind, wanted to get it. Eventually, I got all the core books. So I own the Monster Manual for fourth edition as well, a couple of the core rule books, all the core rule books, and a couple of the supplements. So at any rate, so it talks about the DM style, and gives some tips from the pros, and some kinds of games that that you're gonna run into, which is very very helpful. And then the first chapter closes out with some table rules. How to I imagine the homebrew games and things like that. And then in chapter 2, it goes straight into how to run a game, how to prepare for a game, a lot of prep time. It talks about how to break down the different game sessions, how much time you should devote to it, 1 hour preparation, 2 hour preparations, 4 hour preparations, and then what to do if you have no time or very little time and you have a game coming up and you don't have a whole lot of time to prepare. So it talks about setup, and it talks about narration style. This is pretty interesting when he talks about narration in terms of what the DM how should the DM should control or present the story or the narration of the campaign. And it says, just like the narrator of a novel, a play, or a movie, you, the dungeon master, the game master, serve the essential function of telling the players what is going on in the game world. The game relies on your descriptions of players' imagination to set the scene. And just as an aside, this sort of reminds me of a discussion that's been pretty prevalent in the D&D community, at least online and on Reddit and social media, places like that, about what they call the Matt Mercer effect. And I'm sure if a lot of 5th edition players that have been inspired to get into Dungeons and Dragons because of Matt Mercer and because of Critical Role, that is a little bit controversial in some circles, because some people think that the Matt Mercer effect is both good and bad for the game. It's good because it brings in a lot of players. They're watching this game sessions on YouTube with professional voice actors, and they see people playing, and they're like, that looks kind of fun. I want to get into it. So that's good for the game because it gets more players into the game. And ever since 5th edition came out, and this YouTube critical hit, Critical Role, and the Geek and Sundry from Felicia Day, those type of shows and channels have really put the hobby in the mainstream. But the converse part of that is what happens, some people are concerned about what they call the Matt Mercer effect, which means Mercer is a professional dungeon master in the sense that he's run a lot of campaigns. He plays Dungeons and Dragons, has played it all his life. He knows the rules of fifth edition backwards and forwards. I saw him do a game show type style where they're quizzing, and he got all the questions, most of the questions right. So he knows what he's doing, and plus, he's a professional voice or actor. So this is what kind of this chapter talks about: the different types of the role of narration that the dungeon master brings into the game. And the people that don't like the quote unquote Matt Mercer effect are saying it's bad because if people expect everybody to be like Matt Mercer and to have that high quality of not only experience and knowledge, but just gaming, running, being a game referee, not everybody's going to have that. And so people are disappointed when they get into their games, or so the theory goes, and they don't get that. That's the whole Matt Mercer type critical role type experience. I saw another YouTuber refer to it as glam D&D. What the problem was with glam D&D, and by that I think he means, I'm pretty sure he means that the glamorization and the commercialization has been a big part of fifth edition, which we didn't really have prior to fifth edition or even fourth edition, or even before, because unfortunately there's been a lot of it's always been like stereotype typical, it's a game for geeks, or if you're a loser, you play D&D, you're a loser, or you're those the stereotypes. So this sort of new resurgence of not only fourth edition but fifth edition, and just the hobby in itself, with Wizards of the Coast really promoting the brand, and then the social media putting it in your face for the mainstream, and people are like, "Oh, that's kind of cool. I want to get in that action." And so that's sort of what Matt Mercer has brought to the table. But I talk about that because his is more of the book talks about leading by example and describing the atmosphere in your game session, and if you're going to have a cinematic style, and all that type of stuff. Mercer and people like him, they bring it, and I think they're really good, and they have the total package, So that's kind of what the book goes into. It talks about pacing. It talks about the use of props, and how to dispense information, and things like that. So that's pretty much what improvising also, like how do you improvise, improvisational role, because the DM a lot of times has to take the role of all the PCs, obviously, as you know, if you play Dungeons and Dragons, as well as the monsters, having to control the monsters and battle opponents and all that. And so there's a lot of times where you basically have to improvise, and you're kind of shooting from the hip, because as much as you plan and have preparation in advance, some things are going to come up that are not in the game plan. So you have to call an audible, to borrow a football or sports metaphor, and you have to change the direction of where you thought your session was going, because the players are actually ultimately should be in control. What they bring to the table, they're the ones that are having fun. They're the ones that are playing. They're the ones that are bringing the game session or the role playing to life. And so it talks about how to deal with all those situations. So the first two chapters, or the introductory chapters of the DM's Guide for fourth edition, talks about all of this, and I think it's really good information, particularly for people like myself who are new DMs, or new at trying to run campaigns, as opposed to being a perpetual or a long time player. All right, so what does the DM's fourth edition guide offer besides that? Well, the later chapters go into combat, of course. Not a whole lot of detail on combat, or not a lengthy chapter, because simply because the player's handbook was very detailed. So a lot of the combat rules were very detailed in the player's handbooks, like how to conduct combat and magic and all that stuff. to the point where because the edition was highly tactical, and they did recommend using grids, battle grids, and moving miniatures on squares, which is more of a tactical, more of a wargaming rather than an RPG fundamental. Then that's why combat was so lengthy. I mean, if you look at the player's handbook, I don't know, that chapter on combat is pretty long, but this one is more a lot of you know how to deal with combat for the different scenarios. And then from that, it goes into building encounters, both combat and non-combat encounters, because one thing that I mentioned, I think in the last video, or maybe I omitted to mention about 4th edition that was unique, is the skill challenges. And I don't know if that's something that carried over into 5th edition or not. I don't think it did. Skill challenges were basically, and skills were, of course, introduced or amplified in 3rd edition and 3.5. And then 4th edition skills was like a big thing, because you had this skill challenges that that characters could engage in. And they were first introduced, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 4th edition. And the DM's guide has a whole part of the chapter on that deals with non-combat encounters, and they give some sample skill challenges that dungeon masters can put together for their players, which is extremely helpful. In addition to also having like puzzles, traps, and hazards. There's like a whole section on traps that you can spring on your players, which is very helpful, because it gets kind of tiring if you're just going to have combat. Even though as much as combat is fun, you got to have some variety. So the book allows you to engage in those other non-combat scenarios. And then from that, it talks about there's a general chapter on adventuring, building adventures, adventure structures. What is a good structure for an adventure and what is a bad structure. It goes into high detail about that. And then from there, it branches on to discussing the type of settings, which is very good information to have if you're running a campaign, like, what type of dungeons you can expect to run, how they differ, as opposed to like city buildings and city settings. I think every game that I've been a part of a player has the good game sessions have a good mixture of both dungeons and dungeon crawls, and also what happens when you're away from the dungeon, when you're away from combat, when you're away from those type of settings, and you're just like hanging out in an inn, or hanging out in like a city building, or whatever. So it talks about those type of scenarios. And then chapter 7 of the book is all about rewards. And this, I know for sure, has been discussed in other DM guides from previous editions. Both the 2 types of rewards, of course, in the game is like how to dole out XP, which is your experience for your characters. So it talks about XP rewards, and then it talks about treasure parcels. And this is good. I haven't really seen this before, where most of the guides that I've looked at talk about what the treasures are. And I think there's, I don't know if, I don't remember the 4th edition has. 4th edition Player's Handbook has a lot of information on equipment. But the DM's guide has the treasure that you can hand out after encounters or after your game sessions, how to parcel those out. And it goes into very good detail about how to categorize them, like they call them treasure parcels. This character will get X amount of treasure because they took place in this type of combat encounter, or they were good at achieved all their goals and skill challenges, that type of thing. And then from that, it talks about campaigns, how to run a campaign successfully. And this is also unique to 4th edition. I did mention this in the last video when I was talking about the classes, some of the spell classes, is that one thing that 4th edition does different than the previous editions. I think 5th, I'm not sure if, again, I haven't played a lot of 5th, so I don't know if 5th does this, but 4th edition for sure split the different levels of the characters into 3 different types. So you had your heroic tier into 3 different tiers. So you had your heroic tiers, which was like your first to 10 or first to 12. Some something like that. And then Paragon tier, and after that, when you got to the very high level, which was like almost level 30, 25 or 30, so up there, then that's what they call the epic tier. And it the DM's guide for fourth edition talks about the different tiers and how you expect to deal with those type of characters. From there, chapter 9 is about the world. I found this to be a fascinating chapter simply because fourth edition was a very radical edition, in not only in terms of game mechanics, where it was completely different, like they did a whole 180 from what came before. Not only that, but they also changed some of the lore, some of the story elements, some of the world settings in Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, you traditionally had stuff like the Shadowfell, the Forgotten Realms, those type of settings, the very well-known settings like Dragonlance, Neverwinter. But some of that stuff and some of the details of the lores and the deities and the gods and just the whole universe of and the settings changed dramatically in some ways in fourth edition. And this chapter goes into that, the world settings, and it also talks about the planes of existence. Like the different planes, which have been around since like first edition. Of course, you have the primal, what do you call it, the planes of existence. Like the nine hells, the 9 levels of hells, stuff like that. So it goes into that in great detail, which is it's really good because, as I said, they changed a whole lot of those details. The gods, for example, they're kind of a little different. During the satanic scare of the 1980s, where D&D was being blamed by some conservative or groups that were parent groups that were not, were thinking that was getting people into the cult, that kind of crazy thinking. Well, during that time, because there was the gods and demons were mentioned in the monster manual as foes that you could fight in the different settings, they were all specifically characterized. But a big difference from first to second edition, I know from historical research and reading about it, and actually having played first edition for a while, back in high school or middle school days, was that they didn't have the devils. They did away with the devils after the satanic scare. There were still monsters that resemble devils and demons, but they changed the names around. But anyway, fourth edition kind of goes back, and it changes some of the lore in some very specific ways. So they devote a lot of print to that. There's only 2 more chapters, chapter 10 and 11. So chapter 10 is a chapter dedicated to the DM's toolbox, which is basically how to create monsters and NPCs, how to tweak the monsters, how to tweak the NPCs to your campaign, to your specific campaign. House rules, they sort of get a little more into the house ruling, and they give examples. They get very good examples about house rules, about random dungeons, and just about how to adjust or tweak or tailor your different types of campaigns, and what the tools that the DMs have at their disposal to get this done. I find this information very, very helpful for future DMs or people that want to run their own campaigns. And then finally, we get to chapter 11, which is a completely unique chapter, unique to 4th edition, I should say. And I know this for a fact because it talks about the Fall Crest setting, which is, it gives like an entire setting campaign that you can run within the DM's guide, which is great, which is called Fall Crest, and its key locations. Some of the key locations like Nentier Falls, and if the veterans that played a lot of 4th edition will remember that Nentier Falls was a setting that was developed for 4th edition and further expanded into modules and other material that supplements that people can run in their games. But the book, DM's book actually gives example geography, and it talks about the key locations such as Cobalt Hole, and then it gives you maps and dungeon tiles, or rather, not dungeon tiles, but like grid tiles. You can actually photocopy in the back of the group. There's sample maps and a sample battle grid, and you can photocopy the battle grid if you don't have like a battle map ready to go, or a grid ready to go to have the combat encounters for your miniatures. So that's great, good value for the money there. And that's pretty much those two things. They have combat cards, which you could use for gameplay, and battle grids. Those two things are what make up the bulk of the final chapter. The battle cards, I don't know. Again, I think the battle cards are something that may be included in 5th edition in not the starter set, but the supplement kit. There's a second set that I think it's called Essentials Kit, and I think the Essentials Kits have something akin to the 4th edition battle cards. I'd have to look and double check on that, but those are included in the Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition DM's guide right off the bat. So you don't have to purchase it separately. You can buy more probably, but they include a basic set. So that's a look, very quick cursory look at what's in the DM's guide for 4th edition by James Wyatt, which for the 4E game campaign for how to be a DM in the 4th edition. I think in future videos, like I mentioned before, and blog posts, I'm going to be looking in more detail about how this compares and contrasts to other editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And 4th edition, as we know, is very unique because the gameplay is different. The bottom line is it worth it to you? If you're going to run a campaign and you're going to be a DM, is it worth spending? It's kind of hard to find out because it's not really out of print. You can probably go on, you could probably find it cheaper on eBay than older editions because not a lot of people are. Even though there is a renaissance of 4th edition, it's not a spy. Everybody's playing 5e right now. And some people even thinking that they're preparing for 6th edition, if the coast decides to put out a new one. But it's probably not that much of an expensive. It retailed about $35 when it first came out, and you can find it a lot cheaper. A good copy, probably cheaper if you dig around. So is it worth it as a DM to pick up the book? Yes. They give you, in my opinion, it's totally worth it because they give you 222 pages worth of critical advice and suggestions and ideas of how to run a game. And if you look at the cover, I never really looked at it before, but the dragon there's a sphere, and the sphere shows the cover of the player's handbook, which I thought that was clever. But anyway, is it a good value? Yes, in my opinion, you should definitely pick it up if you're going to run a 4th edition campaign. How does this stack up with previous editions or even the 5th edition DM's guides? Well, I don't know, but that's what the series is going to be about, and I hope that you will tune in again as we explore the other editions of the core Dungeon Master guides that have been published by Wizards of the Coast and by TSR in the past. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe, to like, subscribe, click that subscribe button, and I'll keep making more as time allows. Thank you. Have a great day.